BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, everybody. Today is Wednesday, another Ripper Wednesday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? Okay, today isn't really Wednesday. Today is Thursday. Yesterday was Christmas Day, December 25th, and that landed on a Wednesday this year, so that's why this week's Ripper Wednesday is coming out on a Thursday. Welcome to Ripper Thursday. But yes, most of the time, I do a segment every Wednesday about Jack the Ripper here on Black Box Online Radio, Ripper Wednesday. I also do segments about the Zodiac Killer on Monday and D.B. Cooper on Friday. And in this episode, I will be discussing the story of Jack the Ripper's final victim, Mary Kelly. Jack the Ripper was a serial killer that operated in England in 1888. Whatever happened before or after that is still part of the mystery. The first crime that has officially been attributed to Jack the Ripper was on August 31st with the murder of Polly Nichols, and the final crime, perhaps the Ripper's, let's just say in fact the Ripper's most brutal crime, was on November 9th of 1888 with the murder of Mary Kelly. And I am holding my copy of the book Jack the Ripper, A True Love Story by Win Weston Davies. And this is a book that I've wanted to read for a very long time. I actually received it as a Christmas gift because I'm extremely easy to shop for. The only thing I asked for was Jack the Ripper books, because I've said this many times on Black Box Online Radio, you could spend a lifetime going through all the books and stories about Jack the Ripper, especially if you count the stories that have not been made into their own individual books, and you might not get through them. So, one book that I've wanted to read for a very long time is Jack the Ripper, A True Love Story. And I do have to give credit to Win Weston Davies, because there is this promotional tag on the book that says, Mary Kelly was his final victim. She had taken his heart, and he was stealing hers. That got my curiosity moving, because I wanted to know how he was going to present the story. Mary Kelly was Jack the Ripper's final victim, and she was the victim that was most extensively mutilated. And that tagline there is talking about how Jack the Ripper removed organs of the victims, such as the uterus and the kidney from other victims, but also he took out Mary Kelly's heart. And there are several different variants of the story. One of them is that the heart was placed into a tea kettle that was on the fireside or by the fireside. The tea kettle was so close to the fireside that it started to melt with the heart in it. Another one is simply that the Ripper had stolen the heart and had run out of the room with Mary Kelly's heart. And I don't think the thing about the tea kettle is true. I mean, I think that that would be much more widely documented if that story were indeed correct. But one of the reasons why I wanted to read this book was earlier this year on Ripper Wednesday, I did a two-part book discussion on The Seduction of Mary Kelly by William J. Perring. And that was an effort to give Mary Kelly a backstory, and it was an effort to humanize a victim that has been mutilated by Jack the Ripper, because Mary Kelly's crime scene photo is available online. Anybody can view it. And she was so horrifically mutilated that it was done almost beyond recognition. And a lot of people just simply wonder, what could have driven a person to mutilate another human being in that way? And also, we know very little about Mary Kelly's life and everything that happened to her. And The Seduction of Mary Kelly is a novel. There are lots of fictitious elements that have been included in that, but I read Volume 1, and William J. Perring does have a second volume, but I felt that my explorations into Mary Kelly's story were incomplete, and I knew about this book here, Jack the Ripper, A True Love Story by Win Weston Davies, and I wanted to hear what he had to say. And I also found out that Win Weston Davies is a descendant of Mary Kelly. He is her great-great-grand-nephew, and I'm just going to go through some things here in the book that I will share with you guys, and we're going to go through chapter 1 first, but I also want to provide the disclaimer that when I read true crime books here on Black Box Online Radio, sometimes you'll see something in the title that just says book discussion, where it's like, I've read the book, and I'm just going to talk about the book, and then it's going back on the shelf. And there are other types of books where it's going to become source material that will be included into different episodes over the course of the next year. I mean, we are in December now. Today is the day after Christmas. Happy Boxing Day to you all, by the way. But this is definitely going to be a book that is going to be slowly incorporated into other episodes of Ripper Wednesday and Black Box Online Radio's True Crime Talk radio segment. over the course of the next year. But anyway, if you want to follow along with all of these episodes, you can hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. And you can also go through some of the links in the description box. One of them is for buymeacoffee.com. Buymeacoffee.com/blackboxonlineradio allows you to make a donation or contribution to help the show. And anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. Okay, this is not actually page 1 in the book, but this is chapter 1. It's on page 13, but it is the first page of the book. At some time in either late 1885 or early 1886, a young woman arrived in the East End of London. She arrived suddenly and anonymously, and people wondered what such an attractive woman, who was apparently living a comfortable lifestyle and riding carriages, was doing in the worst stews of the London docks. When she left again some 2.5 years later, it would be in her coffin. And still no one was any the wiser as to who she was or what had brought her there, despite that when her brutally murdered body was found in a squalid room in Spitalfields on the morning of November 9th, 1888, she became, overnight, one of the best known and most tragic characters in British criminal history. She became famous not because of who she was, but because of who had killed her. His name until now has remained a mystery, and her murderer's nom de guerre is known as Jack the Ripper. The crowds turned out for this victim's funeral on November 19th of 1888, and that brought the streets of the east of London to a standstill. Her coffin was carried in a glass-sided hearse behind 2 black horses, and it bore the name Marie Jeanette Kelly, but few people now believe that that was her real name. And this book here by Wynne Weston Davies is going to explore a couple different possibilities. And in The Seduction of Mary Kelly, William J. Perring talks very clearly about how he created this whole backstory about Mary Kelly would arrive in England, but she's telling people that she grew up in Ireland and she lived in a castle back there. And it's mostly, you're given the insinuation that that's all untrue, that she's just spinning some wild stories, but she's also doing this to save herself from some emotional abuse. And there are lots of stories of abuse in the book, The Seduction of Mary Kelly. In this book here, there are different statements that have been shared by Wynne Weston Davies when he talks about how Mary Kelly, was most likely not her real name at all. That was most likely something that she had concocted. And she also used the name Marie Jeanette Kelly, and that's something that you'll really see in chapter 2 of this book. And I even thought about that when I first got into the Jack the Ripper case. Why do sometimes you see the name Mary Jane Kelly and other times you see Marie Jeanette Kelly? And the explanation that has been provided is that she lived in France for a period of time, lived and worked in France, and that she had some type of life-changing experiences there, and she then just used the name Marie Jeanette because she took a liking to it. But I'm going to continue with Jack the Ripper, A True Love Story. Marie Jeanette, or Mary Jane, as most people knew her, took the identity to her grave in Leytonstone Catholic Cemetery. The arc of light of the world's press, the investigative powers of the greatest police force in the world, and the intense scrutiny of hundreds of writers and criminologists since have never succeeded in penetrating the false persona that frightened a young woman carefully encased in herself 127 years ago. But this book here, Jack the Ripper, A True Love Story, is also going to talk about how it was not uncommon for people from Ireland to come over to England to work in Whitechapel as prostitutes, for lack of a better term. And even Hallie Rubenhold, who's the author of the book The Five, who is trying to challenge this narrative that all of the women in Jack the Ripper's victim lore were prostitutes, she does ultimately admit that Mary Kelly was a sex worker. She would have been the only full-time sex worker that would have been murdered by Jack the Ripper. That's her claim. Most people dispute that, and they say that it's just an incorrect take on revisionist history. But here we have some more info about Mary Kelly. Her first residence after she came to the East End was in the house of a character famous in the mythology of Jack the Ripper. Until recently, this character has always been known as Mrs. Bookie. The first written appearance of Mrs. Bookie was in the Star newspaper on November 12th of 1888. The Star, which had been founded less than a year before, had already become by far the highest circulation paper in Britain. After the news of Mary Jane's murder burst upon the world on November 9th, the newspaper sent one of its reporters to the streets of Wapping in an attempt to shed some light on her shadowy background. Other newspapers of the Press Association did the same thing, but the anonymous newshound from the Star succeeded in uncovering more detail than any of the others, possibly because of his employer's bulging purse was capable of loosening more tongues. Now, I think this paragraph is very interesting because the Star newspaper is going to be important for something called the Ripper hoax theory. And the Ripper hoax theory is the idea that Jack the Ripper did not create his own persona and that Jack the Ripper did not write the letters, that the letters were actually fabricated by, firstly, a journalist, and then someone else started hoaxing the letters. And there are two major suspects for the Ripper hoax theory. One is named Thomas Bullen, who worked for the Central News Agency, and another one is named Frederick Best, who worked for the Star. And in the Frederick Best story is one that I've explored a lot here on Black Box Online Radio, and for a long time, I would have just taken that to the bank and saying, yes, this is what I think happened. I think that Frederick Best fabricated two of the Jack the Ripper letters, because out of all the letters that have been written by Jack the Ripper, or allegedly written by Jack the Ripper, the two letters that come into question the most are the Dear Boss letter and the From Hell letter. There are really three letters that are widely discussed and widely reported to have come from the killer, and those would be the Dear Boss letter and the Saucy Jackie postcard. And the From Hell letter is an interesting, there's an interesting debate about its authenticity. But Frederick Best reportedly and allegedly confessed to somebody in 1931 that he fabricated two of the Jack the Ripper letters, the Dear Boss letter and the Saucy Jackie postcard. And as I understand, this was not some type of written confession. It wasn't found in a journal. He confessed to somebody on a carriage ride that he did that. But let's go back to this paragraph in Jack the Ripper, A True Love Story. Why would Frederick Best have done that? The story is that he did that to save the newspaper, The Star. That was how I first learned about Frederick Best's confession to fabricating the Jack the Ripper letters. Well, you just heard that here in this book. The Star, which was founded less than a year before, which that is true, by the way. The Star was founded in the early winter of 1888. Early winter, late winter, I mean, definitely in 1888, but still in the winter season. The Star, which had been founded less than a year before, had already become the highest circulation newspaper in Britain. Well, that doesn't sound like he had to save the paper. I mean, it sounds like the paper was actually doing very well, unless there's some additional information that I don't know about. I mean, sometimes a company can have a big rise and then it just turns into a firework where it explodes and then falls down, or a mushroom cloud. I mean, there are different metaphors that get used in the business world, but that sounds like the paper was actually doing pretty well. Now, if you just want to make the case that, all right, a journalist would have fabricated two of the Jack the Ripper letters because, yeah, the paper was doing well, but they wanted to do even better. They wanted to drive up sales. I mean, I will listen to you. And let me just go over some other points with the Ripper hoax theory and the journalist one more time. No matter whom your suspect is, whether it's Frederick Best or Thomas Bullen, or you think that it was written by another journalist or there were more people involved, this is the Ripper hoax theory and people's take on the subject. Number one, they have the first murder on August 31st of 1888 with the murder of Polly Nichols. Then about 8 days later, 8 or 9, I suppose, the murder of Annie Chapman took place on September 8th of 1888. Then there are all these stories going around. Murder in Whitechapel. There's a serial killer on the loose. Somebody is prowling and murdering women. Someone is murdering and mutilating women. These women are being butchered. But nothing happens for 3 weeks. It's not until 3 weeks later that Jack the Ripper would strike again on September 30th, with the murders of Polly Nichols and Catherine Eddowes, the double event where two women were murdered in one night. So some people think that in between the murder of Annie Chapman and the double event, the newspapers were just like, okay, well, there appears to be a serial killer on the loose. Maybe law enforcement is all saying that he's going to strike again soon if he is not captured. But the story is starting to die down. The mania surrounding Jack the Ripper is going to die down. And one of the examples that was even brought up of someone promoting the Ripper hoax theory was a newspaper using the title, "When Will the Ripper Strike Next?" Not "Will the Ripper strike next?" but "When will the Ripper strike next?" So these are just some reasons about how and why people think that the Jack the Ripper persona was created by newspaper writers. And to you guys who follow Ripper Wednesday will know that I supported the Ripper hoax theory very strongly for a long period of time. However, when I looked at the timeline, though, and you see that the Dear Boss letter was dated on September 25th, mailed and received on September 27th, that's a very small window of time because, I mean, it's almost as if that letter is written and then the murders take place on September 30th. 3 days later, like, did the Ripper just plan on acting to begin with? Did the Ripper act on his own accord, or was the author of the Dear Boss letter actually the killer? I seem to be leaning back that way in a different. I seem to be leaning back in a different way. But let's go back to the book here, Jack the Ripper: A True Love Story. And this is going to be talking about Mrs. Bookie and the who knew Mary Jane Kelly. He reported that the woman who had previously been employed at an upmarket house at ill-repute in Knightsbridge had suddenly drifted into the East End. Although the words suddenly and drifted don't belong naturally together, it was clear that most people who knew her believed that Mary Jane had left previous haunts in something of a hurry, taking refuge in the anonymity of the poorest and most crowded part of the capital, but from who or what she was fleeing remained, like the girl herself, a mystery. But this book is also going to say that again, just people got pulled into the world of prostitution because of the poor conditions at the time. Another reason would have been drinking. And this is all in Jack the Ripper: A True Love Story, in some of the later chapters, when they're just saying that some women would get married in England in the 1800s and the 1880s, and some of them would have their marriages fall apart, sometimes because of the actions of the husband, but other times because of their own drinking, because of their own misconduct, and then they would be left in very poor financial situations, so they would turn to the streets of Whitechapel. And with Mary Kelly, she has a very different story because, unlike the other victims of Jack the Ripper, she had her own room. She lived in the room at 13 Miller's Court. And I think that this is just one of the reasons why people believe that Mary Kelly's body was so extensively mutilated and eviscerated, because she was murdered indoors. She had access to her own room, so the Ripper could have gone inside, whereas the Ripper would have been talking to the women outside or just approaching them in a place where they had nowhere else to go. And this would now, if there is some issue going on where the Ripper talked to Mary Kelly and went to her room, I think that this would indicate that the Ripper was most likely fluent in English or conversational in English, and that's also going to be important because a lot of the Jack the Ripper suspects that get proposed are from Eastern Europe, and their language abilities are even questionable. Not to mention we have other suspects from various countries around the world. But let's look at the Star. The Star reporter went on to say that Mrs. Bookie resided somewhere off of St. George's Street, the polite name for the westernmost end of the notorious thoroughfare otherwise known as the Ratcliffe Highway. The highway, as most locals knew it, was a long-running road parallel to the Thames, and skirting its complex docks just downstream of the Tower of London. It ran to the north of the high dockyard walls, and many of which are still standing, although the docks once protected have almost passed away. In 1886, when Mary Jane arrived on the scene, the highway consisted largely of chandlers' shops, public houses, opium dens, and brothels, all catering to the constantly changing population of seamen, whilst their ships were berthed in what was then the largest port in the world. Mrs. Bookie apparently ran an enterprise of the last kind, and the newcomer, who was, by all accounts, younger and prettier than most of the other women, plied their trade around the streets of Wapping soon as becoming a part of the household. And this is also just some other points, though, that are discussed in this book. This book actually also estimates that Mary Kelly was 5 feet 7 inches tall, and I think that that's interesting because a lot of the height estimates for Jack the Ripper, from the glimpses that people caught of the Ripper, were of someone who was only around 5 feet 5 inches tall or 5 feet 6 inches tall, and that means that Mary Kelly might have actually been taller than the Ripper, and also Mary Kelly was most definitely the youngest victim, although it's quite possible, well, let's just say she was married before, and that she had some type of falling out in her marriage. But I think that the biggest explanations for this, and the biggest explanations for the true identity of Mary Kelly, Marie Jeanette Kelly, are just that things were not widely documented. Intercontinental travel was so popular in the 1800s and things were not well documented. International travel, I mean, even going from Ireland to England would not have been well documented, and people didn't have the same types of visa restrictions that they do in the new millennium, so that they were able to do things like this. And I mean, it would be fascinating to learn all the ins and outs and the stories of Mary Kelly's life and all of her personal details. And I think what people really just want to know is, why would the Ripper mutilate her so extensively? I think he was high on drugs at the time, and that's why he did those things to Mary Kelly. And other people have a different take on the subject. They think that it dealt more with rigor mortis, that the Ripper spent about 2 hours mutilating her body, and then rigor mortis started to kick in and became more difficult to cut through, well, Mary Kelly's flesh and blood and so on. So then that's why the Ripper left when he did. But let's go back to the story of Mary Kelly. She did not stay long with Mrs. Bookie. Within a matter of weeks, she moved to a nearby establishment run by a woman named Mrs. Mary McCarthy. Her house was on the corner of Breezer's Hill and Pennington Street, facing the 14-foot wall which formed the boundary of the huge western basin of the London docks. Even by the standards of the docks, it was an unattractive place, no doubt, close to the dockyard gates. It had the advantage of being one of the first premises that sailors could come across from their run ashore after a long voyage. Well, that would be suitable for someone in Mary Kelly's profession and position, just stating a fact. It is from the time of arrival with Mrs. Mary McCarthy that a clearer picture of the mysterious newcomer emerges. Many of the details are based on the investigations conducted by the Star reporter and published on the 12th of November. They are recollections of the events that happened up to 3 years earlier from a number of different sources, and not surprisingly, the particulars vary according to the police and whom they were talking to. The most voluble was Mrs. Elizabeth Phoenix, who claimed to be Mrs. McCarthy's sister. She had presented herself at Leman Street at the police station on the evening of the previous day, 2 days after the hideously mutilated body of a young woman had been discovered in Miller's Court, and the day before the inquest was due to be open in the Shoreditch Town Hall. She told the police that she believed that the victim might have been the same young woman who had lodged with her in Pennington Street between 2 or 3 years previously. Very soon it was established that she was correct, and that it was probably the policeman from Leman Street who tipped off the Star's reporter. It was by the time that she had moved from Mrs. Bookie's house that the mystery woman began using the name Mary Jane Kelly. Despite the fact that she had initially told Mrs. McCarthy that she was Welsh, there is nothing surprising in her choice of name. It had been estimated that in 1880, between 70 and 80% of the prostitutes in London were Irish, and the result of that, like much other of Irish emigration, was on the successive famines that had swept the country since the potato blight of 1845. And I think a better way of encapsulating that is just that, well, there were economic conditions in Ireland, economic hardships in Ireland. There were reasons that would have driven people out of the country, so they would have just gone to England, and also in very, very intense times of turmoil. Because of this, the word Kelly was frequently used as a synonym for a prostitute, and many unfortunates, as lower-class prostitutes were known, used it whenever they needed an alias. I mean, again, this was all going to be dealing with stuff that is going to be somewhat reasonably unwell documented. The stranger soon changed her story and then sat with a better adopted name, saying that she was in fact Irish and had been born in Limerick and taken to Wales as a baby when her father sought employment in the iron industry. Few people appear to have been taken in by this, however. An unnamed woman who knew her later when she was in the lodging house at a Doss house on Thrall Street stated categorically that she was Welsh and she spoke the language fluently. Now, I mean, I don't know if that's been certified, because, I mean, you will read a lot of descriptions of Mary Kelly, and they don't state that she was Welsh and that she grew up in Wales, or that she spoke fluent Welsh. It is yet another enduring riddle surrounding the girl who called herself Mary Jane Kelly. If she actually was Welsh, why would she have wanted to appear Irish? Welsh or Irish, however, most people agreed that she was better educated than the other girls, and had a sort of, according to Mrs. McCarthy, she was no mean artist. So I think that Mary Kelly's story is going to be very fascinating, and I also have noticed that there's a certain amount of connection that people have to the Jack the Ripper victims, that people want to explore with the Jack the Ripper victims. because this relates so much more to the story than just, well, who was the killer? As I said, with both William J. Perry and Win Weston Davies, they want to add this type of humanizing element to the Jack the Ripper case. And I still was caught by the title, Jack the Ripper, A True Love Story. I want to know how exactly Win Weston Davies is going to be exploring that. What I've really done for you guys is I've read chapter 1 and talked about some of the mystery surrounding the woman known as Mary Jane Kelly. And I'm going to be incorporating this into different Ripper Wednesday episodes, which might be something to the effect of, okay, there's a 5-minute block here and a 5-minute block there discussing the book Jack the Ripper, A True Love Story. But I am so glad that I am in the possession of this one. And one more time, this is by Win Weston Davies. You can get it on Amazon. I believe it's only in paperback form. That's why I requested, these things as Christmas gifts. When it comes to electronic books, I just do the one touch purchase on Kindle. But anyway, thank you so much for listening to this week's Ripper Wednesday, and let me know what you think about the Ripper hoax theory. Let me know what you think about Jack the Ripper's choice of murdering his victims, and some other examples of how people have connections with the victims is that there is a book that is written about the murder of Liz Stride by David Yost, which is also one that I want to read in the future. And I know that this might not be the most popular segment for Ripper Wednesday. I know that some people might not even want to hear about the backstories of the victims at all, but I do, and I think that it's also something to explore. And I think that it's all definitely connected to Jack the Ripper, and it's important to explore all the different alleyways and avenues and highways. As you heard, they have had highways too, and we're going to see what we can learn along the way. We're going to see the stories that we can find along the way, and we're going to see how people have shared the stories of human behavior over the course of the last 136 years. So if you want to tune in next week for an episode about Jack the Ripper, one more time, you can hit the like button and subscribe here on Black Box Online Radio, and I will see you guys tomorrow, actually, talking about D.B. Cooper here on Black Box Online Radio. That's all for me now. I am your host, Black Box Ned, and until next time,